I'm Irene Strasser from the American University in Cairo, Egypt, and I'm happy to introduce the fourth keynote speaker for today. Erica Burman is a critical developmental psychologist based in the UK. She is a professor at the University of Manchester, and in the past has held several visiting professor positions in Spain, Brazil, Norway, and South Africa. Erica is the co-founder of the Discourse Unit, a trans-institutional and transdisciplinary center for the study of the reproduction and transformation of language and subjectivity. She has published numerous books and articles on developmental psychology, childhood, feminist theory, and qualitative, particularly discourse analytical research. Erica Burman's book, Deconstructing Developmental Psychology, has become an important resource for many scholars who approach human development from a critical and feminist perspective. I'm always starting my lifespan development classes with the chapters on childhood, motherhood, and mother love and attachment as social constructs, which usually opens up wonderful discussions about deconstruction and reproduction of gender and social relationships and how we perceive the normative and the normal in our everyday lives. But even beyond that, Erica's work helps understand how developmental psychology and developmental psychological theory and research on child development also serves to regulate and standardize family and parent behavior, how it pretends universality by marginalizing working class and ethnic minorities, by prioritizing the global north over the global south, and how it pathologizes women's experiences with being mothers. I am particularly happy that this semester I got to tell my students not only have we read Erica Burman, but she will visit us and give a keynote talk. My apologies, I'm just using the term visit here as if we were physically all together at one place. But you will be talking about space in a moment. So it is on me to be quiet now, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Lockdown Vistas, Space, Time, Solidarity, Action. Erica, thank you so much for being here with us today.
I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Mike Garfield, whose death from COVID-19 I only heard about yesterday. As a former colleague, not a close friend, he was a benign presence in various contexts. This is a level of mutual engagement that reflects aspects of my argument in this paper. And I'd also like to thank Mike Hewitt for the poem that we heard this morning. Okay, 23rd of March was the day the lockdown began in the UK. Amazingly, early that morning, I had an eye operation, a cataract removal and replacement in my right eye. Instead of a more conventional hello, the surgeon's greeting to me was crazy times. He was an NHS surgeon and I was an NHS patient. But this was a private hospital still functioning when the NHS, the National Health Service, had stopped functioning, had stopped doing these non-urgent operations. Perhaps the challenge to my bodily integrity in my anxiety about whether the operation would take place or not, I really hadn't considered what the operation would involve and its aftermath, but perhaps that challenge to my bodily integrity, the enforced immobility or debility, because I couldn't do much and certainly I couldn't exercise or lift more than a cup for the first week, and the dependence on my long-suffering partner for even the simplest household or personal tasks, including washing my hair, the severe limitations on reading, all of this coincided with the declaration of the lockdown. At first, there was a part of me that, perhaps unsurprisingly, didn't attend to it so much. After all, by now it was not so unexpected. And another part of me that thought that this was a good moment for an enforced convalescence. But the not seeing, the anxiety about recovery, the physical disruptions to vision and estrangements of visualization, after all, my two eyes came to see very different images, all of this probably exaggerated my sense of psychic as well as physical fragility, along with the apocalyptic news. Since the situation of the pandemic is unprecedented, one of many overused words, even as it was also, as we now know, foreseen, then words, procedures, activities, ways of being and ways of seeing have become unanchored from their usually stable position. Sorry. Before and during the operation, the theatre operations manager, Jason, held my hand throughout the procedure. Now tears come to my eyes even now, recalling just how reassuring that was, how he was so reassuring, how that confident, competent, and above all, human touch, no latex gloves, how unimaginable now. How could he take such risks, the inner voice now says, as well as his voice. It comforted me so much. That skin-to-skin animal connection of bodily warmth sustained me. It literally and metaphorically held me through that period of very high anxiety. That access to touch in particular is what so many people have missed amid the lockdown. Yet in the chat before, alongside commenting on the crazy times, we waited for a correction to an error about my date of birth on the hospital records. They had me down as 7 years younger than I am. When I half joked about the recent news reports that ventilator treatment might possibly be denied to the over 60s, a category I will shortly join in the corrected records, Jason told me he'd been in the military for 11 years doing this work. Note how theatre operations manager nicely conjoins military and health performance discourse. He said that hard decisions were made all the time as a routine part of that job. That was meant to be reassuring, which it kind of was in that context. But I was waiting to have a cataract removed, not for ventilation. So this is the outline of what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll go through it as we go along. So we all have our lockdown stories, and I mobilise mine, albeit acutely conscious of its banality, insignificance, privilege. I'm grateful to have been pulled out of COVID-19, torpor and stupor, that is both physical and mental stagnation, by preparing this talk, in part through consideration of the very nature of this paralysis. At the very least, this prompts reflection on the significance of taking seriously the embodied character of mental life, via the ways thinking is affected by the conditions imposed on our bodily freedom and activity. The sense of being fixated, arrested, of being incapable of anything beyond the obvious has seemed widespread, of being occupied and overwhelmed, intruded upon by unwelcome states of mind. Now, I've already mobilized my key themes of vision, space, time, subjectivity, and they form the themes of this paper. Vision is a key theme for Lacan, of course, the link between image and imaginary, between what is seen and the generation of, through the inciting of fantasies of self and other, exemplified by the mirror stage. These quasi-logical, rather than developmental stages, map out the emergence and functioning of psychic life with a focus on misrecognition and how the subject strives to compensate for this. Frantz Fanon, of course, took this up in terms of the specific misrecognition of the skin and body, of racialization, exploring its psychoaffective and psychopolitical consequences. Fanon's emphasis was on embodiment and phobia, negrophobia, with the skin as a social signifier of racialization, what he, of course, calls epidermalization. Even within an individualist, Eurocentric frame, the threatened or abjected container of the individual body was extended by the psychoanalyst Esther Bick to consider the protective role of the second skin that is provided by the care of others. It is this tangible, visible care of others that is noticeably absent under lockdown. That is the voice and touch that Jason gave me in a routine operation, all gone. Moreover, the threat to individual bodies, has extended to challenge the very nature of our social bond, both as our collective presence spatially, but also present and future, i.e. temporally. As Didier Anzieux, who had his first analysis with Lacan, might have put it, this is an attack on the group ego skin, since the image of the body, this is a quote, and its schema are two of the principal organizers of the group. It's not too far-fetched then to consider what we're experiencing is an attack on our narcissistic group envelope, such that its envelope of rules, surveillance and prohibitions, again from Anzieux, that is the rules of lockdown and socialization and social isolation, are perhaps futile efforts to try and reconstruct that damaged second group skin. After all, consider the frantic efforts to maintain investment in, even to reconstruct that social order, as in the 200,000 and more phone calls from members of the public, documented by the 1st of May, to British police reporting infractions of social distancing rules. Consider also what it is tempting to see as a willfully ambiguous and misleading, as also willfully victim-blaming current UK government message, stay alert. Now, the term lockdown is a two-word contraction, presumably thereby losing time and agent reference, so suppressing who is doing what to whom and when. It is in fact North American rather than British English, unlike furlough, another erstwhile unfamiliar word to me anyway, which apparently has Old English origins. But lockdown is also rather new, and the Cambridge Online Dictionary had been updated only 3 days before I looked it up. It comes from descriptions of hostage or hijack situations where there's an imposed confinement or effort to contain. The question arises then, what's being maintained or preserved? Securing is of course a matter of confining as well as rendering safe. Now, the injunction to stay home pins us into capitalist relations of spatial rights and entitlements that multiply the meanings of possessive individualism. But of course, staying at home means very different things according to what kind of home you're in. And this is not only about whether you have big rooms and a nice garden, although it is also this, as well as who does the housework, childcare and cooking, which hopefully now gain more appreciation. For many people, home is the least safe place to be. And in the UK alone, the last month has seen the deaths of women at the hands of their partners triple the usual, if contested, claim that 2 women die a week from domestic abuse in the UK, while elsewhere, for example, in Mexico, femicides are escalating. But alongside the protective advice to stay home, keep safe, there is threat. For the world and life itself, as the publicity campaign puts it, really raises the stakes on the existential threat to all of you or us together in blue and white medical colours. Put so abstractly, life itself need not include us as individuals or even collectivities. It is just what it is. Being confronted with one's insignificance in relation to the world and life itself is scarcely reassuring. Alongside the claims to stay at home, and the effort to ward off lockdown panic or paralysis, exemplified by the kitsch exclusionary nationalism of jingoist appeals to keep calm and carry on, that was the never used World War II propaganda, which acquired cult status in 2005 and is apparently having a resurgence now. Alongside all that, how do we stay thinking and stay thinking critically? After all, many people are not in, and the differential race and class effects means that we are far from all together. If it's hard not to experience the lockdown as a form of occupation or colonisation, then the association with being held hostage sets out some identificatory positions worth reflecting upon, I think, while the fact that by whom and when we were locked down remains unspecified, leaves ambiguous whether this is something done to us or what we do to ourselves. Are we being interpolated into a kind of Stockholm Syndrome where we learn to love as well as obey our captors? and potentially actively collude in our own possible demise, or as Kelly Oliver put it, referring to the colonization of psychic life, the colonized suffer from an obsession with gaining love and recognition from their harsh dominators. What is the pandemic state, the current pandemic state, and our nation states in particular, doing to our states of mind? What modes of nationalist as well as global collectivity are we being recruited into, and how might we resist these? I'm going to explore three different, albeit all psychoanalytically informed frameworks to think through these questions. Fanon's psychoaffective discussions of colonization, group analytic discussions, and Lacan's model of group-constructed individual subjectivity. In all these, vision inflects and produces group and individual subjective possibilities, including of and for solidarity. Douglas Fisek discusses Fanon's use of the word petrification in The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon mobilizes this term to refer not only to the mental and physical stagnation produced by settler colonialism, but also to account for the strong, if not fundamentalist, in Fisek's gloss, adherence to traditions and customs this produces in the colonized, however bizarrely, suggesting this functions as an outlet for their anger. Such dynamics can be recognized in the rituals we may invent or try to maintain through this period of captivity, what Zizek, of course, designates as enjoying one's symptom to help us cope. The mental as well as political links between conservation and being conservative, that is, of restraint and constraint, are resonant. Being petrified suggests being rendered immobile, turned into stone by fear, a lockdown of the mind as well as body. Anxiety and fear prevent thinking, or rather rational thinking. We are vulnerable to wild fantasies and paranoias and obsessed with minor trivialities. No wonder that sightings of unidentified flying objects have recently massively increased in the US, and such ways of thinking benefit, as Fanon points out, the colonizers. It produces the internalized state of being colonized and so renders them compliant. Believe me, Fanon says, the zombies are more terrifying than the settlers. And in consequence, the problem is no longer that of keeping oneself right with the colonial world and its barbed wire entanglements, but of considering 3 times before urinating, spitting, or going out into the night. Following Fanon's own engagement with existential phenomenology, especially that of Sartre, Fisek notes the aptness of petrification as a metaphor in terms of how the colonized is rendered into a thing. Fanon, of course, writes extensively of thingification, the rendering into object rather than subject status of the Black person, of the colonized, of being forced into a zone of non-being by virtue of being deprived of human freedoms. This is an ontological as well as political state. Indeed, in one of his final but only recently translated and published talks, Fanon writes of how colonialism seeks to maintain its power by making itself appear timeless, eternal, that is, by eradicating its historical contingency. This not only violently, epistemologically and psychically, as well as politically and economically, displaces the memory of a pre-colonial time, it also forecloses the possibility of a future time without it, or at least tries to do so. From Fisek's analysis of Fanon, we might say that the bad faith, as the existentialists would put it, of our governments, is that this is all for our own good and our compliance competes this circle of bad faith, except in our dreams, of course, for Fanon treats these as zones of resistance and recollection that another world is possible. Fisek writes, what is petrification, if not the presentation and subsequent enforcement of certain meanings as necessarily true, as ontologically divorced from humanity itself? Fisek points to 2 kinds of durable inertias that Fanon identified as inscribing colonization and its successors. First, there is the inertia of colonial meanings and institutions, which can survive formal independence and reappear tragically and ironically with an indigenous dramatis personae. And second, this is a quote from Fanon, there is the inertia of the anti-colonial meanings and institutions whose petrification in the supposed post-colonial world can lead to ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism. Indeed, in the essay in Wretched of the Earth called Pitfalls of National Consciousness, Fanon was indeed remarkably prescient of the ways colonial dynamics would restructure themselves to reappear when the ruling and middle classes took power post-independence. In our times, we hear of the small business people suffering and claiming victim status, mobilizing with hashtag small businesses matter and flouting social distance and isolation rules to demand a return to business. The danger of racism is, as we know, all too present, from the ways Modi's India and the RSS are using the lockdown to intensify their anti-Muslim program, while the lockdown has not stopped the Israeli state demolishing houses in the West Bank that thereby increase infection rates by the further concentration of living arrangements into more populated and ever smaller spaces, even as it has also further warranted supposed justification for the siege on Gaza. As the head of the WHO, Antonio Guterres, recently commented, the health crisis of COVID-19 has rapidly become a human rights crisis, while the obscene scandal of the disproportionate deaths running at 3 to 1 of people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in the UK highlights not only how we are not, in fact, all in it together, but rather that racialized and class inequalities in their historical legacies and their current enactments deeply structure what life itself is. Another expression of lockdown inertia reminiscent of Fanon's analysis is what he calls forms of mental pathology associated with relatively calmer periods of colonization. This is the aggressive boredom, though boredom is far from a straightforward affect, wrought by enforced inactivity and suppression of activity, masking a seething resentment that sometimes erupts destructively and displaced in relation to those close by rather than directed to the source of the oppression. Fanon writes of a neighbour being set against a neighbour, or the exaggeratedly enraged response to a child's crying at night, not insignificantly drawing his next example from a concentration camp. That is, the seeping of colonialism into the psyche produces diminished and disturbed forms of subjectivity, dismantling the sense of a joined, if not even joined up, connection to a broader social collectivity. 15 years ago, Kelly Oliver wrote a piece entitled The Good Infection, referring to the war on terror and dynamics of terror and terrorization. This takes up Fanon's account of phobia, which of course Fanon develops into his theory of negrophobia, alongside Kristeva's account of abjection as a defense against ambiguity of psychic borders, such that the fear and aggression that seems to come from others is in fact the subject's own. Oliver highlights how this process relies on internalization of superego elements that in fact deplete, devalue, and subjugate the subject further. The good infection is the ways we as ideological subjects accept and host or identify with noxious affects that produce racism and xenophobia out of the desire to be good and to feel better. Her analysis seems, I think, uncannily relevant to the moral political injunctions, both encountered directly, but also exercised by the subject upon itself in dealing with the lockdown. And what these analyses of colonial dynamics show is that what is internalized evacuates further rather than fills the psychic gaps. Put simply, we dig ourselves into ever bigger psychic holes. As she puts it, the logic of colonization is paradoxical because it requires the colonized to internalize the lack of an interior soul or mind. This brings me on to space-time and the logic of subjective construction. So vision is central to Mark de Kessel's characterization of Lacanian ethics, epitomized by the figure of radiant Antigone. De Kessel discusses anamorphosis, that is, how the subject is constellated by its viewing point, psychically composed by what it takes to make the physical image legible, sensible. This is a compelling way of accounting for how we become subject to and subjects of ideology. In the social distancing dance, we are constellated as, through our mere biological being, an enemy, a threat to the other, as they are now invited to see us. Perhaps this is also why clapping on the doorstep for the National Health Service for a few minutes on Thursday nights, as we British are encouraged to do, offers some comfort, even as a government-sanctioned cheap ploy to mobilise gratitude to our workers, cheaper than paying them a proper salary. This is the one time in the week where we legitimately look at, see our neighbours, engage in a joint activity with them, clapping to confirm not only our support for our essential health workers, but also affirming our presence, that we are here at this moment together. It is a moment of companionship, of shared subjectivity of and engagement with a common predicament. Vision, lack of vision, action and its variable durations and suspensions are all central to Lacan's parable of the social structuring of subjectivity, the logical time sophism, in which confinement is very much at issue. Pitted against each other, the solution to the problem of identifying what disc, whether black or white, each prisoner bears on his back, so unseeable to himself, and which he must narrate in order to get his freedom, all this turns out to involve the escape or liberation of all of them. Lacan describes a relational logic by which the subject discovers their own identity on the basis of inference from the actions or lack of action of the others. Paradoxically, reciprocity of positioning and joint emancipation emerges from what is posited as a competition, even a zero-sum problem. Crucially, this arises from three distinct temporal stages: the instant of the glance, the time for comprehension, and the moment of concluding. The first, that is the instant, and the last, the moment, are obviously described as very brief, while the time for comprehension, that is the period of deliberation, which is in fact based on the observation of mutual hesitation or interruption of action by all parties, this has a duration of logical significance. It is necessary for the conclusion to be drawn, and it is this process of deliberation that also demonstrates the necessity of a subjective element to objectivity. So undoing that binary between objectivity and subjectivity, since the temporal lag or suspension between the glance and the deliberation of the significance of what is seen or not seen is an objective, if perhaps fleeting matter. This also is what makes social subjectivity necessarily reciprocal. That is, it's individual as well as collective, but necessarily also individual, even as this individual is created through that interpretive navigation that gives rise to the physical rush to the door. It is this moment of the glance that connects the group analytic perspective. There's the rush to the door. That connects the group analytic perspective on median dynamics, highlights how size matters. Now, median groups in group analytic thinking are larger than small groups, but not as large and so potentially alienating as very large groups, defined as those that cannot be seen in a single glance. Lacan's sophism relies on being able to encompass the entire scene and its protagonist in a glance, that is, a single view. This is what links the relatable and the unrelatable, that are both central to the notion of solidarity, which is, after all, a unitary solid, which is also multiple. Action is the key here. It is through action that objectivity rapidly consolidates or renders solid, note the link with solidarity, the subjective shifts of doubts, hesitations, and deliberations such that these logical moments appear synchronic to the observer. And so, as Lacan puts it, the assertion of certitude is desubjectified to the utmost. Significantly, solidarity is defined in two ways, according to whether it is countable or uncountable, unifying bond between individuals with common goal or enemy. The uncountable, a more abstract psychological or material support, and the word comes from the Latin solidum, whole sum. What is posed as the relation between part and whole, then, is both a qualitative and quantitative matter. And outside conditions of vision, those distinctions become blurred. So truth, the truth of the subject, while irreducibly subjective in origin, becomes objective because it is temporal and not only spatial. It has to be played out in specific, logically distinct temporal stages that take the assertion of social subjectivity beyond doubt to certitude, and so beyond a merely spatial configuration, that is, of the prisoners who are imprisoned, happens through assertion, action. Perhaps this approaches what Fanon called being actional. Action positioned in critical, albeit positioned in critical as well as constructive friction with Lacan, Fanon's radical humanism envisaged a post-racialized world where personal and institutional histories have been transformed. But like Lacan's notion of anticipated certainty wrought through assertion, this process of transformation is an active one. Fanon writes in many times in Black Skin, White Masks of effort. This effort is to transcend mere reaction. The effort to transcend mere reaction is what is needed to recapture the self and to scrutinize the self, he says. It is the effort to be actional rather than only reactional, since there is always resentment in a reaction, he says. Similarly, Lacan claims there is no pre-formed subject, but one produced by interaction laid out in space and time, recomposes the shifting relational subject, revealing itself at each moment as the subjective unfolding of a temporal instance, or more aptly stated, as the slipping away of the subject within a formal exigency. Elaborating the wider implications of this sophism beyond the bridge table, Lacan distinguishes between the notion of collectivity and generality, defining collectivity as, quote, a group formed by the reciprocal relations of a definite number of individuals, which he contrasts with generality as a class abstractly including an indefinite number of individuals. Yet both conceptual and political limits frame scaling up the logical time model. While in principle, the problem could logically be extended to refer to larger numbers, he notes, however, recalling group analytic analyses, I think, that temporal objectification is more difficult to conceptualize as the collectivity grows, seeming to pose an obstacle to a collective logic with which one could complete classical logic. Once again, the moment of the glance brings the embodied physico-material to the fore. Circumventing the scene, to assess how each relates to the other, presumes a stability and knowability of the extent of that scene. That presumption is, of course, an affective relation, the time of deliberation that articulates the qualitative and the quantitative, the distinguishable from the mass, even if one cannot qualify or characterize what the distinctions are, but both of these are central to solidarity. If political progressives are typically drawn to Lacan because of the potential for a socio-historical analysis and critique, his practice was, of course, notoriously individualist, and the largest group in the École Freudienne, as with the logical time sophism, is four, a cartel. Moreover, Lacan frames the sophism with some significant caveats, emphasizing its fictive status as a logical problem, rather than as something to put to empirical test, but also acknowledging the limitations imposed by what he euphemistically describes as our epoch's antinomian progress, such that although only winners are anticipated or foreseen here, the facts diverge greatly from the theory. That is, the social contract might be forged from a claim, an assertion that in its performance becomes a truth or certainty, but of course the conditions for that performance of being able to be recognized as a man or human subject are frequently contingent, as Lacan puts it. Arbitrary, as Lacan puts it, characteristics, as the allocation of black or white discs. Lacan hints at the wider resonances of designating black and white discs as involuntarily ascribed markers of identity. And it's well known that Lacan was well aware of and engaged with the Algerian liberation struggle, if only via some of his family members. Moreover, it's important to ward off the superficial reactionary reading of the fact that everyone emerges in his account as a winner by virtue of recognizing their similar characteristics. This would be a very reduced, individualist, ethnocentric and exclusionary model of solidarity. There is clearly a lot at stake in considering what kind of other we are mobilized as and galvanized by when we walk by, approximate, or reciprocally socially distance another. Yet Lacan's reference to the potential for barbarism in collectivity also insists on the residual preservation of the individual subject. Indeed, he concludes by echoing but subverting Descartes' famous syllogism, affirming the basis of doubt, but also negation, which he then claims provides the logical form of all human assimilation, precisely insofar as it posits itself as a simulative of a barbarism, which nevertheless reserves the essential determination of the I. That is, for Lacan, as also Fanon and Sartre, there is no escape from the I of individual responsibility, or what more recent Haraway and new materialist accounts might name responsibility, even in the recruitment to barbarism. And where group analysts and Lacanians would agree, therefore, is that there is no group mind, but rather it is the fear of losing one's individual mind, whether by that paradoxically creates such. Now, social distancing a matter of the past, but there's little sign of that. At any rate, I can foresee that just as we look back at the time before being isolated in our houses, etc., we might equally look back on the lockdown as a space of possibility, of creative potential wrought by the enforced retreat or cocooning, as what my writer friend prefers to call it. And so we might ask, is failing to do all the wonderful, creative, exploratory, practical projects that one fantasizes about an act of solidarity or connection with a world that is so out of joint? In the same way, George Peric's account in A Man Asleep of obsessing about washing socks in his bedroom sink could perhaps be read as a sideways response to the torpor of French colonialism. Or are such responses symptoms of being flooded by the cruel superegoic functions warranted by the good infection that Kelly Oliver was writing about? At any rate, this has been a period of suspension, to use another Peric concept, a brief period when new imaginary collectivities generated from the crisis are incited to cherish our health services and essential workers, and even right-wing national governments are forced into paying for health, welfare and unemployment support that could be seen as socialist, or alternatively merely, as one commentator put it, spraying money at the meltdown. This lockdown may become a time before the imposition of a made by those who are hearing about bankruptcies, layoffs, cuts, that make the previous decade of austerity pale into insignificance. Aurillac on her album Strange Angels, dedicated to Walter Benjamin, where she imagines Hansel and Gretel drinking schnapps and gin in Berlin, and Hansel says, "I wasted my life on a stupid legend," before Gretel utters a version of Benjamin's Angel's famous lines. But Benjamin's message is also, of course, critical of the angel who looks back, even as it cares about the debris but is blown unwillingly away from rectifying the damage that it sees into the future. It is the stupid legend, the storm of progress that we have to stop. The demand has been to stay in. In fact, it's quite an achievement to make not doing something, that is not going out, active, an act of solidarity. Even the word stay has its origins in stopping doing something, in deferring or delaying rather than occupying. It is a temporary or time-limited state, rather than a dwelling. In origin, the term is temporal, therefore, rather than spatial. Stay is as much about desisting or stopping as it is about doing something. And this remains in legal discourse as in the phrase stay of execution. So are we waiting for Godot? Are we waiting to get back to normal, or are we waiting for the revolution? Many of us have been waiting in lockdown, yet the bare life of life itself, as the British government campaign put it, makes profit. The masked profiteers and government withholding and provision are a case in point, revealing the toxic, tragic occlusions and overlaps between oligarchies, national government policies, and transnational capital. Here it's worth recalling the third danger that Fanon identified, how liberating leaders betray their promises and try to put the activated population to sleep again. I first drafted this paper as the tabloids loyally celebrated Prime Minister Boris Johnson's return to resume his ministerial duties. We must recall and maintain the self-organisation, the revival of civil society mobilisation, the mutual aid organisations, the wellspring of generous support people have shown to each other, despite rather than because of state policies. The solidarity forged across differences and in the face of massive incitements to psychic and socio-political retreat, that is to stay in. All of this must not be bought off or dispersed post-virus. I have been discussing the political significance and the dangers of vision then, both metaphorical and literal, in the project to interrogate and to reclaim models of collective subjectivity. Group analytic accounts highlight how the lockdown threatens to foreclose the relatable social that is vital to participatory democratic mobilization, such that in current conditions of restrictive mobility, we are in danger of being subject to wilder mental states that render us mindless. These are not, or not only, our nearest and dearest long-standing intimate relations that we are excluded from, but also what a recent columnist dubbed the near-ish and dear-ish. That is, casual relations built from intimacy, but involve some mutual misrecognition, misrecognition, the two go together, and acknowledgement. From Lacan, what is highlighted is that this is a temporal as well as spatial question that also produces the subject as unique and general, and that topicalizes the role of action. What we can envisage, note the visual metaphor, not only depends on what visual scene we're placed in and how this changes and changes us as we move and as we act, it is also, as Lacan notes, not only a question of time, of teleology, of knowing where we're going, but may well change the destination. After all, the social distancing dance demands continuous reciprocal reorientation. Imagine a 2-meter apart tango. It's not just what order we are in the supermarket queue, going round already laid out one-way routes, but how move around each other in our specific trajectories. Most simply, claiming who we are and what we know is a relational process constructed with others and bodily enacted in materially specific historical geopolitical conditions. Obviously, we don't need Lacan to know that, but the reminder about the importance of anticipated certainty in subjective assertion that will get us out of lockdowns to it's socially and materially produced. It highlights the inextricability of the subjective and objective wrought through vision, that is space, and time, duration, as well as physical movement. It offers a new take on notions of extremacy that also takes us out of the loop, so to speak, the Mobius strip, between interior and exterior subjectivities to pose other questions. Recall how in 2008, capitalism was denaturalized, with the markets shown to be fragile, unstable, fictional collective subjects subject to collective error and meltdown. Columnists and talking heads pronounce on the need for a new normal now that isn't simply a return or intensification of previous decades of austerity, of profit and exploitation of people and the planet. There are dire predictions for the global economy, while the health crisis could well have been predicted and prepared for. Consider, for example, how the UK has halved the number of hospital beds since 1999. How to harness and sustain positive transformational possibilities amid the catastrophe. From disaster capitalism, can we have, as Zizek suggests, disaster communism? Do we really want a strong state or no state at all? This discussion of psychic spatial temporality differs from, but is connected to, recent discussions of acceleration or attention to different velocities of governance, which have featured recently in critical psychology. Alongside the political ambiguities of vision, who and what we see and don't see, I've been discussing time, stagnation, suspension, staying, waiting. The psychoanalytic literature on waiting explores this as a fruitful time. On waiting lists, people usually get better, or else they die. Lacan portrays waiting as a logical necessity, the hesitation that enables or gives rise to the certainty of subjective assertion. However, feminists align waiting with care, invoking an alternative to capitalist exploitative clock time that lies beyond the social and material production binary that recent analyses have extended to the domain of the non-reproductive, the waiting of just being there, accompanying and tolerating alongside the suffering of another. Julia Kristeva identifies as women's time the struggle to reconfigure the socio-symbolic contract beyond what she calls the sacrificial. This time is, as Alice Jardine put it in her introduction to Kristeva's piece, cast in the future perfect tense, which is a modality that implies, she says, we are neither helpless before some inevitable destiny, nor that we can somehow, given enough time and thought, engineer an ultimately perfect future. Indeed, the future perfect is evoked by Kristeva to, quote, characterize a new social formation now in the process of rediscovering what part of it has forgotten. Jardine's question about what will have to have happened before this makes sense, is addressed to political conditions that demand subjects both individual and collective. What has been revealed via the virus, by state and transnational responses to it, including the lockdown of bodies and minds, alongside the free floating of capital, must not be forgotten. If Lacan was equivocal about what kind of subject was being asserted according to which political conditions, others have been clearer. Fanon's radical humanism may seem at odds with Lacan's resolute anti-humanism, but both were critiquing dominant versions. And Fanon, as is well known, was a close, if also critical reader of Lacan. Fanon envisaged a post-racialized world where personal and institutional histories have been transformed, and where alienation, the separation of psyche from itself and others, and the sense of shared projects can be claimed and forged anew. Common to both is a notion of action that traverses the intrapsychic, the interpersonal, and the political. To quote Fanon, to finish now, he says, "To educate man to be actional, preserving in all his relations his respect for the basic values that constitute a human world, is the prime task of him who, having taken thought, prepares to act." And so I finish. Thank you.